There. This is so neat.
Yeah. This is my first time doing a live stream on YouTube. Usually all of my YouTube performances are carefully edited. So we'll see how this goes, but I'm looking forward to it. Thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to be with you today.
Absolutely. And these are fun. I have to tell you, it's been so last year, I thought that I only did like 60 some of them, but I did it,
Hmm.
ended up with almost 80 in the entire
Oh, wow.
year of eat and greets. And I was like, that is crazy. And so many people, though, have said the same thing, like to just do it and come live. That
Yeah.
was like the new experience. So I just feel like a trusted little servant to kind of usher everybody into their live stream experience. I'm like, come, it's safe. People are nice. The
Yeah.
water is warm, that
Mhm.
kind of thing. So yes, hi everybody. Welcome to today's eat and greet, where hopefully in the next little bit of time we're going to give you something that is worth the time you took to show up. I'm so happy to have you here. And today we get to like jump kind of into a topic that really comes from the classical training from Hellenistic astrology. It's got its roots in it. And we
Mhm.
don't always just kind of focus there. Sometimes I feel like we get away from some of the just really traditional concepts and practices. So it's really neat to have Nate Craddock with us today to be our tour guide around primary directions. So welcome, my friend. Welcome
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
to the internet. So before we jump in here and talk about all of this good stuff, keep in mind that yeah, we're still eating greeting all week long. We're not done quite yet, but also we're kickstarting. So if you haven't had a chance to check out the Kickstart campaign yet, it's in the description box down below. As well, I will make sure all of Nate's information is down below as well. And I heard before this that he's got a little something stewing. So make sure you go check him out. I won't be giving it away, but go check him out for sure, you guys. So, Nate, man, I know that this is like, I feel like at this point, it's like the weirdest question, but it's such a good one. But
Mhm.
like, how'd you get into astrology? How did you land up on Astro Island?
Oh my gosh. Well, I wrote a book about it entitled Charted Territory, a memoir and manual. And that was my first entree into the astro publishing world, but I published that last year. And so I'll tell the short version of the story. And I distinctly remember to the day that this happened, and it was all over afterwards. So I have two older sisters. One is 4 years older, and the other is 6 years older. And so my oldest sister, the one who's 6 years older than me, got her driver's license, and they went to the mall one day together and got these pens from Claire's. And I'm sure that if
Yes,
grew up in the suburbs going to the malls, Claire's is a cherished experience of yours, as it as it was for
absolutely.
me as well, as a strange fat gay kid. But
Yeah.
so they went to Claire's and they brought back these two pens that had different perfumes on them. So they were like scented pens. I don't know if they were like gel pens or whatever, but one of them had Pisces on it, and one of them had Gemini on it, which are my two sisters' tropical sun signs. And I looked at those pens and I thought, oh, these are cool. And they said, don't tell mom about these. Don't tell mom about these. For context, I grew up as a preacher's kid. My dad is a United Methodist pastor. My mom was raised a good Southern Baptist from South Central Virginia. Um, I myself am in the family business these days, so that's a whole other story. But anyway, so
I'm
they
like, hold
said,
on, we maybe want to hear that.
oh yeah, we'll put a pin in that one and come back to it. Um, but I said to them, "Oh, what is this? What are these things?" Because of course them saying "Don't tell mom" piqued my interest, and they said, "Oh, these are I forget what they said, but they said like these are our signs or our sun signs or our horoscope signs." And one of them said, "I'm a Pisces. I was born in March." The other said, "I was born in June. I'm a Gemini." And I said, "Well, what's mine? I was born in September." And they said, "I don't know. Go look at the newspaper." And so I frantically ran over to the recycling bin where the day's newspaper was, and I opened it up to the horoscopes, which were right next to the comics, and I never put them together. And I looked for my birthday, and so I'm born September 18th, so I'm a Virgo. And I said, what is a Virgo? And they don't tell you, of course, in the newspaper what each one of them is. So I go back into the room where my sisters are, and I say, what's a Virgo? And my sister Andrea, who was in Latin in high school at the time, said, "Oh, like a virgin or a maiden." And keep in mind, I was like 10 going on 11 at this point, so I didn't quite have all of the mental machinery there to understand what virgin meant. So I said, "What's that?" And so she just said, "It's a maiden." But then they started making fun of me and saying, "Ha, Nate's a maiden." And I decided, well, I'm going to learn everything I can about Pisces and Gemini and figure out what's going on with you all. And then so that was like movement one of that. The other like big motion that happened for me that got me into astrology, and really I'll say that astrology is for me like part of like a broader love of nature and of natural philosophy and of living in this profoundly beautiful world that has just captivated my imagination since I was a little kid. But there was one instance where my dad, again, pastor at a United Methodist Church, brought home from a church rummage sale this 1-volume encyclopedia on the history of astronomy. And it was full color. It had these beautiful prints and plates from like Renaissance texts and paintings and all kinds of stuff. It had all the way up to like diagrams of like Stephen Hawking level stuff and black holes and all the new photos that had come in from the Voyager mission. So like that was like a smorgasbord for like nerdy little kid me who was super into it. And so I got really into not just the cool new stuff like black holes and supernovas and that kind of thing, but I also got into, the planets have stories attached to them. They have narratives. They have different things that they interact with in the world. So like Mars is associated with fire, and Jupiter is associated with life, and the moon is associated with water. And I thought that was just the coolest thing. And then of course my mom found out that I was into it, and she said, "No, you're not allowed to be into this." And I said, "Watch me." So I kind of continued studying under the radar for, so I was like 10 when I got into it, and really didn't have the freedom or the latitude to study it all the way and to get really into it until much later in life when I turned 24. So about a month before my 24th birthday. Those of you who know annual perfections, this will ring some bells for you. When I was 23 and 11 months old, I came out as gay, and that kind of completely upended my entire life at that point. And I was actually doing directions on my chart the other day, kind of reanalyzing that period of my life, and it's right there in the directions. Yeah. But so I at the time I was deeply, deeply entrenched in evangelical culture, and those of you in the audience who have an evangelical background, or you have family or friends who are in that world, know that that is a closed set way of being in the world. Everything that comports with that particular view of the world is good and it's safe, but if you're outside that at all, like you get ostracized real quick. So I'd always kept my interest in astrology and like the history of astronomy or natural philosophy kind of under wraps. But then after I came out, I was a pariah anyway. So like, well, I guess at this point, everything is licit at this point. So I got into it. And actually the person who kind of reintroduced me to astrology as an adult was one of my professors at the time, from my music graduate school program, who was just this really cool, really weird person. But we were over at his house for like some departmental thing, and he had his horoscope from not Astro.com, but it was one of the other sites. And this was in 2013. He had his horoscope on the fridge, and I saw it and I said, "I know what these are." And he saw me looking at it and started explaining, "Oh, here's this, here's the ascendant, here's the midheaven, here's the sun, here's this, here's that, here's this, here's that." And again, that was like another turning for me. That was certainly another turning point in my life. And from there, it was just kind of like a square curve. You know, it started increasing and then just took off. And by the time gosh, maybe like March of 2017, when Neptune was right on my north node, that Neptune north node transit, that's when it's like, this is what I want, like this is my thing. And so I, you know, as a nerdy kid, I went through a lot of different phases of special interests. I had different special interests in lots of different things as a kid. Another part of this story is that I'm neurodivergent, but that's really a conversation for another day. So I had all of these special interests, which is pretty typical for non-neurotypical folks, to have one thing that we're super into. And so I thought it was just going to be, oh, it's another passing thing. Nope. It was again that square curve where now at this point I have been so in the astrological way of viewing the world and that way of engaging with reality that what I have seen, I cannot unsee, if that makes sense. Like I can't go back to not having that as part of my lens for viewing reality. And I think the work that I'm doing right now, personally and internally, is to try to bring together a lot of the different traditions that I've been exposed to, that I've been raised in, that I've been trained in, both with respect to astrology and also as a student of religion, also as a student of music, also as a student of the humanities and of natural philosophy, to see how all of these things really work together as like an ecosystem of knowledge. It's not just astrology over here in a silo, you know. And those of you who see clients know that good astrologers are folks who have like a broad view of lots of different subjects and lots of different material and media and narratives. So I feel like my training and my upbringing, you know, as difficult as it was in some respects, you know, going to a conservative evangelical liberal arts college, the emphasis on liberal arts, I think, was really helpful for my becoming who I am today as an astrologer and as a professional religious person, and you know, all the other weird things I'm into. But yeah, that's how I ended up as an astrologer. And I carry that narrative and I cherish it. You know, it's, even though it has difficulties on the way there, I wouldn't trade it for anything, because those difficulties, whatever they are, they've formed me into the person I am. You know.
Yeah. I just love that you're like, well, I've come out and upended this whole thing, and by the way, I'm also an astrologer.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Here's that.
Yeah, there's that. There's just throw it on the pile with the other weird stuff.
Like, I'm just going to save you guys 5 years of processing. Just do it all at once. Okay. Right. Like, I just love it. And I couldn't agree with you more. Like, all of the struggly stuff, I think, makes us better humans and better professionals, whatever our industry is, especially in astrology. I don't know, I feel like astrology, in my experience thus far, is so much more rich after someone's had the opportunity to kind of like have a little kick in the teeth with life, you know, and that is, you know, it is not exclusive. I think there's plenty of good astrology before that, but for some things to take root, I think we have to be unrooted out there in the world.
I think that's the gift of Saturn, certainly.
Oh, sure.
And of Mars too, you know, if we want to talk about the big bads in astrology, Saturn and Mars are often get a bad rap, but really, like, the processes of refining, that's a Mars process. The process of uprooting and building structures, that's a Saturn process. So like, even though those Mars and Saturn directions or transits or whatever technique you're using where those planets are highlighted, those experiences that one has during that season, you know, what I'm not going to say is that everyone's suffering should be approached as, you know, an opportunity for growth. And if you're just suffering, you're not looking at this as a growth opportunity. I'm not going to say that. That's spiritual bypassing. That's not helpful. But what I will say is that, you know, the perspective that one gains from getting through something, then being able to go back and look at one's own development through that thing, that can be a really rich and empowering source of learning, you know. So that's how I am engaging with stuff from my past like that. And I don't want to say that that's right for everyone, because sometimes the stuff that we go through is stuff where we have no real, you know, volition in it. We have no real agency in it. Things like, you know, systemic evils and that kind of thing. So I just kind of want to like fine tune how I'm saying that a little bit.
I think you said
if that
brilliantly.
makes sense.
Absolutely. I think that there is that thing, like the glossing for sure. We want to make sure, you know, life is in those the depth of the experience where it's like, I am uncomfortable. I don't like it. I am suffering. I'm struggling. I am whatever. And we can't just do it, you know, just, it's a growth opportunity. Like, yeah, sure, it is.
Yes, and also it sucks.
And it also blows. Yeah. But so it sounds like, and from the little bit that I know about your practice, you're really in that classical field. It's the Hellenistic sense is where you come from. And is that, you know, I know you said you had many different interests, but were you always down that realm, or did you kind of end up that way, or how was it? How'd you get there?
So I'll preface this by saying I have a Moon-Saturn conjunction and a Mercury-Saturn sextile. Mercury is on the 9th house cusp, applying to the sextile of Saturn, and the Moon and Saturn are both on the 11th house cusp, applying to a conjunction. So those of you who are able to delineate on the fly like that, we'll see. Oh, I like old shit. I don't know if I can swear, but
yeah, totally.
Okay, great. So I like old shit. And so I trained as a classical musician. I had a Latin minor in college. When I was in graduate school, the things that were super interesting to me were like medieval notation. That was one of the, oh, do I even have the book? Oh, yes. The notation of polyphonic music from 900 to 1600 CE. Like this kind of old stuff, I love it. But, you know, that's not to say that I'm not also engaging in a process of like expanding and refining. I think for me, what's really important is that our practice has roots, that our practice has connection to a tradition of some kind. And it doesn't necessarily, like nobody, what I'm not saying is that everybody needs to go out and become a Hellenistic astrologer, or everybody needs to go out and become like a William Lilly style astrologer. That, again, that's not what I'm saying. But for me personally, those roots are really important. And I think that I think that those classical ways of engaging with our art offer the fruit of centuries of practice, of centuries of observation, and of centuries of data. So you go, you know, talking about the subject for today, primary directions, that comes right out of book 4 of the Tetrabiblos. It's that old, and astrologers have been using it and refining it for centuries, and it got even more precise and even more refined during the Renaissance. And it seems like one of the things that I'm actually really keen on is the way that the development of astrological reasoning throughout history, especially in, I don't want to say the West in general, because actually the Persian Empire and the Arabian Empire also had very, very important influences in the development of astrological reasoning and in the technique and in the math involved in astrology. I think staying connected to the sources of those particular traditions is deeply important. But one thing I'm really keen on is the fact that like so much of the math that we use every day was developed kind of in tandem with astrologers needing to say, okay, I need to figure out how to measure a distance on a sphere when I only have, you know, angles to work with, you know. I mean, that's basically what we're doing with primary directions, is we're measuring distances on spheres. And this is so the other thing is that, so in elementary school up until about 6th grade, I considered myself good at math, whatever that means. And then I hit 6th grade and I had a teacher who just wasn't a great pedagogue. And that was at the time, of course, I was in 6th grade, I was hitting puberty, I was, you know, everything is weird and bad right now, and it kind of stayed that way. So like, you know, my math skills faltered, and so I got it in my head that, you know, I'm bad at math. This is not an area of intelligence. This is not an area of competency that I have naturally. And I'm just going to have to settle for being bad at math. And so, of course, I threw my energies into other things like languages and music and that kind of thing. But since starting to learn primary directions, I have done more math in the last year than I have done, gosh, the last decade. And I think I think that astrology is just kind of like a government ploy to get gay people to be good at math. That's a joke.
I don't know, because I will tell you, I think it works on the straight folks too, because I am like you. I was like, oh, math, kill me now. And then I really got in astrology, and I was like, we meet again.
We meet again. Yeah.
That's so funny.
But yeah. With respect to the classical tradition, you know, I was also a Latin minor in college. I went to seminary, so I learned Greek and I learned Hebrew, and so I learned the language that Ptolemy wrote in, right? Like, and so I already had like an entree into that world. I also had an entree into the philosophical world of the Hellenistic and the early Renaissance astrology, the medieval and the early Renaissance astrologers. So I'm like, well, I'm kind of dealing with that anyway in my day job most of the time. So why don't I, you know, really invest the time and effort in an area that honestly, I just enjoy it. I love it. I think one of the things that also comes up too is that so often in modern society, we're pressured to justify our choices and justify our preferences and justify what we're into when really it's okay for us to like things.
Right.
Who would have thought? It's okay for us to do something just because it's fun. And it's also okay for us to do things without having to monetize them, but that's a conversation for another day.
Oh my God, that's like 6 other episodes right there. Like, absolutely. Well, so it's kind of neat though to see the lens that got you into it and the thinking behind it. I always love to hear people's experience with how they feel called and pulled into their particular line of study, you know. And I have my own stories with the different lines that I've been able to be a part of. So I just always think it's a beautiful thing to hear it, because it's like we really do. I feel like if people will tell their stories, other people can hear their story. You know what I mean? It's like, if you don't, you gotta give it away to keep it a little bit. Kind of that idea. But so let's get into it. Let's talk about primary directions, and they come right from classical practice. I mean, the whole dang thing comes from classical practice.
And what does classical practice come from but long-term observation of the actual sky? Long-term observation of the actual sky. And that's one of the reasons that I wanted to get into primary directions. And I wanted to, since like I really kind of started the upswing on that square curve, because I had always heard about them, and I heard about their predictive accuracy, and I heard about their I also heard about their famously difficult math required to actually to calculate them by hand. And I said, that sounds like a challenge. So I also have challenge accepted. I have natal Mars in Aries, so I'm not going to back down from a challenge. But yeah, so I tried to kind of get the math under my hands myself for a long time. I tried to cobble together sources on how to actually read them. One of the best sources from the classical tradition on how to actually engage with primary directions from a practitioner's lens is book 3 of Christian Astrology by William Lilly, where he talks about, here's how you calculate them, here's how you interpret them. Of course, he's giving you math as it was practiced in the 17th century. So that's not enough. So what you need a good guide to actually begin to work with primary directions. You need somebody to, well, I don't want to say you need somebody to show you them, but you need a good resource. You need a good handhold. But essentially, what primary directions are. So, if you're outside looking at the sky, so you're in the northern hemisphere.
Hold on, I gotta stop you right there, friends. I just want you to be clear that That's what he said. Like, we have to go outside. Like, we have to go. Astrology is out there. It really is happening out there. So we're going to go outside. Field trip time. Okay.
Field trip time, outside.
I'm out.
So if you're outside and say you're looking south and say you're an astrologer and you've just attended the birth and you've got a really solid handle on what the natal ascendant is, you know what the natal midheaven is, and you know where all the planets are, and you can point at them and say, here's this, here's this, here's this. And imagine as you're looking south, you see that, for example, Saturn is over to your upper left. So it's somewhere in the 11th house or so. And knowing the houses, you know, oh, well, Saturn in the midheaven means this thing. So it means Saturnian themes coming out in the realm of a person's career or public status or image or that kind of thing. So what primary directions attempt to do is to figure out how long in real time does it take Saturn to come to the midheaven, or to any other point, but for the sake of simplicity, think with the midheaven. How long does it take Saturn to come to the midheaven? How do we measure that? How do we measure that arc of distance? We actually do it using the coordinates of right ascension and declination. Again, that's another conversation. But we're taking that symbolic time it takes Saturn to reach the midheaven, and then we're calculating that. We're applying a calculation to it to turn it into years, right? So the rate of things coming to the midheaven is about 1 degree per year. So let the midheaven be at 2 degrees Sagittarius. Let Saturn be at 7 degrees Sagittarius. Saturn will come to the midheaven in about 5 degrees of right ascension. Right ascension is the coordinate that's generated by the Earth's rotation. Right ascension is not associated with the zodiac. Right. So we've got 2 different coordinate systems we're using. But we follow Saturn and right ascension over to the midheaven when you see that it takes about 5 degrees. And Ptolemy's conversion for right ascension to years is 1 degree of right ascension for 1 year. So we know that Saturn will come to this native's midheaven when they are, 5 years old. So midheaven's at 2 degrees, Saturn's at 7 degrees. At that point, around 5 years old, we would expect to see something Saturn-y happen in that native's life. Now, the midheaven traditionally rules public status and image and all of those things, but the midheaven is also associated with the mother. So you might see some manifestation of a Saturn-type situation having to do with the mother at that time. Sure. Or you might, different example, say the midheaven is in Libra and Saturn is also in Libra. And say that Saturn is in a trine to a planet in Aquarius who rules the 5th house. I can't imagine charts that quickly in my head all the time.
We're all going like this.
Yeah. So say that Saturn is in a positive configuration with the ruler of the 5th house. Saturn's exalted in Libra, midheaven's in Libra. That Saturn comes to the midheaven when the native is 5 years old, and it brings into manifestation the quality of exalted Saturn in a supportive, applying aspect from the ruler of the 5th house. What does the 5th house rule? Well, it rules music, it rules games, it rules all kinds of things. I'm just thinking of what if this kid gets into playing chess when they're 3 years old? And what if they're really good at it because they have that applying received trine from the 5th ruler to Saturn? When that Saturn comes to the midheaven, already as the natal exaltation ruler of the midheaven, that's going to be an event that propels that kid into chess prodigy stardom or something like that. And that's an extreme example, but you can find kinds of things like that. The other thing that you can do with primary directions, let me dial it back a little bit. So we've got a couple of technical terms we're working with when we're thinking with primary directions. So we've got, first off, the significator. Okay. The second is the promittor. This The significator stays in one place. So the midheaven, if you're outside looking at the midheaven stays in one place. The ascendant stays in one place. The motion that's actually happening is the motion of the sky carrying Saturn, or carrying Mars, or carrying the trine aspect of Venus to the midheaven, right? Sure. So the significator are the static points. In classical primary directions, the 5 significators that you always use, and this is, again, right out of Ptolemy. It's also in Christian Astrology, book 3. Martin Ganston talks about it in his book on primary directions, and I'll give book recommendations in a second here.
Sure.
The classical 5 significators, from which you can draw pretty much all aspects of a person's life, are as follows. The ascendant. We all know what the ascendant is. The midheaven. The sun, the moon, and the part of fortune. If you've done any study in classical astrology, you will know that those 5 points are called the 5 hylegical points. Those are the 5 points that are considered able to give life, or most associated with the main pillars of a person's life. So the ascendant, body, appearance, vitality, general circumstances, what it means to be incarnate. That's all the ascendant. Midheaven, what is the legacy of this person? What are they here to do? What stories are told about them? What's their impact on the world? Sun, what's their soul here to do? What's their vitality like? What kinds of honors and awards and recognition are they receiving in their life? The part of fortune, what do they have in order to be able to support their life? What's their property situation like? What are their resources like? That's all part of fortune. Then the moon, what's their emotional heart center about? What's their interaction with other people in the context of emotionally based relationships? So the moon we direct for marriages and relationships, which doesn't necessarily always work. It works. The symbolism is definitely emerging from a patriarchal culture, of course. And so the moon, it's assumed that it's primarily men who are getting their charts read because, emperors and stuff have astrologers. But so the moon has this kind of classical association with women or female-bodied people. But the moon also has association with the idea of marriage.
Sure.
The other thing the midheaven is association with is children, because having a child is a change of public status, right? So really we're reducing, not in a reductive way, but almost in kind of a summary kind of way, all of the different things, all of the different aspects of life to these 5 primary points. But you can also direct other things too. You can direct Mars and Venus and Mercury for their respective kinds of, for their respective significations. Sure. You can also direct other Arabic parts. You can direct, you can use house cusps as significators, but the easiest way, and I tend towards minimalism in my practice, the easiest way to go about it is just use the 5 hylegicals. So we're using those as significators. Those, if you think of the chart as like a harp, those are like the 5 strings that actually make music when things are directed to them.
Beautiful.
So then you have what are called promittors. Promittors. Sometimes you'll see it as promissors, but more correctly in Latin, it is promittors. And the promittors are the pieces that actually move, that we're actually watching come to a particular significator according to the primary motion, which is where the word primary direction comes from. It's the primary motion of the sphere of heaven rotating once around every 24 hours. The promittors are going to be those things that come to the actual significators and create an effect. So Saturn coming to the midheaven, that's a promittor. So of course, when Saturn comes to the midheaven in that example I gave you, we've got this child prodigy becoming famous for being really good at an old game, that Saturn in Libra.
Queen's Gambit to the final, yeah. But at like 5.
Yeah. Speaking of Queen's Gambit, I just finished it like 2 nights ago and I'm super into it. So if y'all play chess and want to play with me, look me up on chess.com. Okay. Aside from that, I'm also a Virgo.
Perfect. Yeah. So it would be actually a really good game then, huh?
Yeah, I really, but the thing about chess and this is a complete digression, but so my husband and I have started playing a game of chess every night just to keep our game sharp. And I noticed that this, like, the same cognitive space in my brain that I use when I'm reading charts is active when I'm reading a chessboard, because it's pattern recognition, right? That's such a huge part of our art, is recognizing patterns, especially if we're using a graphical representation of the chart, whether it's, you know, a classical chart or a dial or a square chart, if you're you know, a classical Hellenistic or a Jyotisha practitioner, you're recognizing patterns, right? So that's all there. It's the same thing. But yeah, so we've got significators and we've got permitters. Now, the way that primary directions developed in the 16th and 17th centuries, and the way that they were developed in the 20th century, almost uses primary directions like a souped up form of transits. And I think they have that utility, certainly, because primarily what we're getting with that form of primary directions, we're really just looking at conjunctions of permitters to the 4 angles. And those are actually the easiest to calculate, because if you have a if you have
the angles aren't running away.
Right, the angles aren't going anywhere, and they're always in the same place, right? If you have a table of rise and set times for your birth date and your birth location, all you need to do is just find the difference between the time you were born and the time that a planet rises, culminates, sets, or anti-culminates, convert that into minutes and divide it by 4. That will give you a number.
4 minutes.
Yeah, it's 1 degree of right ascension for every 4 minutes, right? So that's a really quick and easy way to calculate primary mundane directions. And there's a reason that I said mundane, because planets also have latitude, right? So imagine that the ascendant is at 10 degrees Aries, and the natal Venus, maybe not natal Venus. Let's pick an easier planet to direct. I mean, they're an easier planet to interpret. I don't know. Okay, yeah, okay, great. Yeah, so here's what so Aries, 10 degrees Aries is rising, which means the 10 degrees Libra is setting. So we know that Venus is the ruler of the 7th house. Let Venus be at 20 degrees, not 20. Let Venus be at 28 degrees Aries.
Okay.
28 degrees Aries. So we know that we're actually looking at 2 different points there, because let that Venus also have positive 5 degrees of latitude. What we're going to see is that the body of Venus is actually going to rise before the zodiacal degree of Venus.
Sure.
And primary directions, as they're practiced classically, look mainly at the zodiacal degree, not the actual body of Venus.
Okay.
And that was one of the things that some astrologers in the Middle Ages noticed, and they said, wait a second. The degree of Venus hasn't risen yet, but her body's already above the horizon. How do we do that? So when we're looking at the actual body of a planet, that's where mundane primary directions, that's the mundane frame of reference. In Latin, it's called in mundo. So when does the body of Venus actually rise? So again, coming back to our example, say that the zodiacal degree of Venus, again, 10 Aries is the ascendant, zodiacal degree of Venus, and let's just put this person's birth on the equator. So, well, that's not going to work. Never mind. But what's going to happen is that the body of Venus is going to rise before the zodiacal degree of Venus. And what we'll see is we'll get a manifestation of the body of Venus rising before the zodiacal degree of Venus rising. So one way that this might happen or shake out in reality, again, Venus is the ruler of the 7th house in this example. Say that body of Venus rises and you go away to summer camp that summer.
Oh,
and you meet someone.
Oh, yeah.
and you have like a really cool connection with them, and they're super fun, and they make you feel good, and they make your belly feel weird and all that kind of thing, because you're 15 at the time when the body of Venus rises. But then 3 years later, the degree of Venus rises, and you show up at new student orientation for your first day of college, and it turns out that person you met at camp 3 years ago is there. So you're getting this kind of repetition of symbolism, right?
Sure.
That's exactly how this kind of thing works. When a planet rises in your life, or when a planet rises in your chart, what it represents rises in your life. That's one way of thinking with primary directions, at least in terms of the mundane primary directions. And the way that directions are primarily developed in the 20th century. However, go back to Ptolemy, go back to the Hellenistic astrologers, go back to the Perso-Arabic tradition, and also go back to like Western India and the Tajika tradition. The way primary directions are used in that framework is less as a series of souped up really important transits, which they are, you can think about them that way, but they're actually primarily used as a Time Lord system. Okay. And they are used as the highest level of Time Lordship. And the way the Time Lord of a given period is determined, so coming back to the ascendant, and let's put the ascendant in. Let me pull up a chart so I can.
Yep, I was gonna say that's where we're at. People are like, okay, we need a chart.
Yeah, we need a chart. We need a chart. Okay. Do I have sharing permission?
I think so. I believe so.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So I'm going to share my screen with y'all, and
good. And I'm going to just throw this in there for you to. Sure. We'll come back to it, but we've had also Kathy Rose over, and we did a lovely chat about solar arcs. So I'd love to tap on that so we can kind of see what we got going here with all that. So, but first here.
Yeah. Okay. So let's see. Let me orient myself correctly to the particular chart. Okay. So this is the chart of Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, and one of my favorite people. Those in the audience would do well to notice that I am reading her chart sidereally using the Krishnamurti Ayanamsha and Alkabishus houses. Her ascendant natally falls at 15 degrees of Pisces. Let's see. If you look over here, you see these small subdivisions of each of the signs into little unequal chunks. Chonk, spelled with an O, is clearly a technical term. But these little slices of the sign, these little uneven slices that look like a pizza that was cut by a 9th grader at Domino's, these are called the terms of each sign. You might also know them as the bounds or the confines of each sign. And each of the 5 visible planets that is not the sun or the moon rules a section of each sign. Each non-luminary planet has a term in each sign. So when Governor Whitmer was born, she started out with her ascendant in the terms of Jupiter. And then if we hold the ascendant as the significator, we see that if we hold this there and we watch the zodiac rise, and of course we'll have to do all the math to determine what rises when, but we'll see that really what happens is the ascendant moves through each one of these terms in succession. The term ruler of a significator, where it's directed, is known as a major time ruler. So so when the ascendant, for example, right now in Governor Whitmer's chart, is directed to the terms of Saturn and Taurus. So we know that Saturn is a really significant planet for her in this season of her life when her ascendant comes to, or rather when the terms of Saturn and Taurus come to the ascendant. In 2018, Governor Whitmer was elected as the governor of Michigan. And I wanted to point out where her directions are at that time. So at that time, the ascendant had been directed to the terms of Saturn. So we know that Saturn is an important planet for her. It's switched on, it's active for her. We also have her midheaven up here directed to the terms of Mars in Capricorn. So the terms of Mars in Capricorn slowly come to the midheaven. And when they reach the midheaven, Mars becomes the planet that rules the midheaven. Note the condition of each of these planets in the nativity. Mars, exalted with the North Node in the 11th house, right? It's also retrograde. It is applying mutually to a trine of Saturn. The moon is also involved in this grand Earth trine, supporting this exalted Mars, a very powerful Mars. So we want to know what a particular planet is doing in the nativity when it becomes the ruler of a particular section of time for a person. So the other thing that happens in 2018 is that Governor Whitmer's son, right here, her son, S-U-N, not her child, which is conjoined Regulus natally. Regulus is at 6 degrees Leo sidereally. The terms of Jupiter have come to the sun. Jupiter natally is in the 8th house, ruled by exalted Mars, right? So we've got, again, another really doubled up Mars activation that year. Now, if we look, let's see, at the solar return. Well, before we get to the solar return, let me just say this. So these term rulers set out major periods of a person's life. So when your ascendant is in Mars terms, that's a major Mars period of life. When it's in Jupiter's terms, it's a major Jupiter period of life. And you'll expect the kinds of situations described by Jupiter or Mars or whatever planet, just in general. So they're natural significations. So like if ascendant is in the terms of Jupiter, you might go to school, you might take a course, you might join a cult. I don't know. It depends on your Jupiter, right?
What you got going on?
Yeah, you know, just you see what you got going on. But you always want to take into consideration the condition of the natal planet. So you got that. The next layer down from primary directions are annual perfections. Annual perfections. And I'm sure I feel like that's a pretty well-known use. I feel like that's a pretty well-known technique, at least on my corner of Astro Twitter. I don't know. But so you have you have the annual perfection of the ascendant through each of the signs, one sign per year. So let's take a look at Governor Whitmer's solar return for 2018. And this is really where primary directions come in the classical model, because what they are high-level time rulerships where this chunk of your life is going to be described by this planet as it exists in your nativity, right? And then the particular situations that emerge from it will be shown by the permitters. So for example, if you, like Governor Whitmer, have your midheaven directed not only to the terms of Mars, but also the most recent permitter to come to it was the conjunction of Mars. We know that when we have major Mars activations by annual perfection or by transit or anything like that, that exalted Mars is going to manifest through the midheaven, right? So let's see, let me scroll down my list of directions here. So we've got, midheaven directed to the terms of Mars right now. And that happened right before her 47th birthday, right? Remember, she was elected governor in 2018. So we know, okay, Mars is going to produce really good conditions when Mars is activated as a time ruler, regardless of the significator that is directed to the terms of Mars. Jean-Baptiste Morin makes the point that dignified malefics in the nativity generate the more positive side of their significations, but usually with some kind of conflict or with some kind of delay or some kind of situation that kind of spoils it a little bit, but it's still there. You're still getting the good from it. And, I couldn't ask for a better Mars if we're going to have a Mars direction. Also, of course, she has a night chart, So we know that Mars is going to be much more constructive than he otherwise normally would. So Mars directs, or the terms of Mars direct to the midheaven right before she turns 47, right? We also know that her ascendant is in the terms of Saturn. So when she turns 47, what sign does her annual perfection come to? Comes to Aquarius. She's already been in a Saturn ruled year. She's getting another Saturn ruled year. And we have the natal Mars Saturn trine activated for both of these years, right? So really, really strong indications of bringing this Mars this Mars manifestation into being. Now, let's look at her solar return for that year. So the third level of this predictive hierarchy, and this was the development of the Arabic and Persian and Tajika astrologers, was the use of the solar return as like an additional lens to kind of filter and give better resolution to what we're looking at with the directions and the perfections. Look at her solar return. Solar return Mars in the 10th house of the solar return. Solar return ascendant in Aries. Saturn is over here on her natal midheaven. So let me put these two wheels here together so that you can see the repetition of these particular points. So we've got Mars, and we know that Mars will transit the natal Mars. It will also transit the terms of Mars in Capricorn, where the directed midheaven is. So we'll want to look during the year, okay, when does that actual transit happen? We know there is going to be something. Again, Mars is in the 10th house in the solar return. Saturn is on the natal midheaven. But then there's this other thing that happens too that is a little, I didn't notice it at first until I started going through each of the points and saying, okay, where's the part of fortune at? Where's the sun at? Where's the moon at?
Sure.
So the sun is directed to the terms of Jupiter in Libra. So we know that Jupiter is an important ruler for the sun. Do you know when Jupiter transited her natal Jupiter that year?
Oh gosh.
The election day.
Yes.
That's where the sun was.
An expansive, a big day.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Oh,
yeah.
Wow.
So Jupiter is making a square to the natal sun, which is directed to the terms of Jupiter. Jupiter is ruled by natal Mars, right? Transiting Jupiter is ruled by Mars at that time, which I think had moved to Aquarius by the time of the actual election. But nevertheless, I mean, the strong Mars activations are right there. And if you want to use outer planets, Pluto's on the midheaven too. I mean, somebody coming into power on a platform built on, this was her campaign phrase, let's fix the damn roads. I can't imagine a better chart that illustrates that particular point. But the challenge with using this particular predictive hierarchy, and this is, I commented to my husband a couple of nights ago as I was just thinking through this again. It's just like, since learning this particular methodology, it feels like I'm getting like a firmware update that the hardware of my brain can't handle.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a lot to like take in. And it's like you said, you can't unsee it once you like do. So you kind of have to get in there.
Exactly. You can't unsee it. But once you've seen it, oh my God, it's right there. It's right there. But again, all of this emerges from observed astrology. Now, the origins of the terms themselves are up for a little bit of debate because they feel arbitrary, but there's some really good research out there on the origins of the terms. And I don't know if anybody's kind of caught off guard by me using a sidereal zodiac to do this work, but there's a reason for that.
Okay,
the
good.
Reason,
ask.
Yeah. So the reason is that I learned, this is not like, this is not going to be a revelation for anyone. So, but the reason is that this is the best book on primary directions on the market. It is entitled Primary Directions, Astrology's Old Master Technique, and it is by Martin Ganston. Martin Ganston is a scholar with background in Sanskrit. He's a Sanskritist, and so he knows Latin, Greek, Sanskrit. I believe he knows Hebrew and some Arabic
just
as well.
A couple things.
Right. Yeah. So his particular area of interest is the development of the astrological tradition of the Tajika astrologers in India. Tajika refers to Persia. So his argument is that so many of these particular techniques developed in contexts where the sidereal zodiac was being used. Now, the sidereal, like Valens, we know, is using a sidereal zodiac. Ptolemy was not an astrological practitioner, and he is the one who really popularized the tropical zodiac. But for much of the development of these particular techniques, like tropical and sidereal existed alongside one another. And in my own work and with charts, I personally get better results with the sidereal zodiac. In fact, one of the things that kind of like sealed the deal for me on using a sidereal zodiac with this particular prediction stack. Let's see if I can find my notes where he's looking at this. It was in my 2011 solar return year, and my sun at that time was directed to the terms of Saturn in Libra. So first off, the entire time my sun was directed to the terms of Saturn in Libra, my sun's in the 8th house anyway. He's not doing so well. And the sun is in fall in Libra, and of course the terms of Saturn are not a fun time for anyone anyway. That period of my life was the worst period of my life. However, that was also the year that I came out. And Saturn is my ascendant ruler, right? So when it comes to who I actually am versus who I think I am, Saturn is definitely the one we want to look at.
Saturn's like,
yeah,
that's working for a while.
Exactly. So looking at these, looking at that year for me, the very day that Saturn ingressed into tropical Libra, so of course Libra begins with the terms of Saturn, the very day, not subtropical Libra, sidereal Libra, forgive me, the very day that Saturn ingressed into the first degree of sidereal Libra was the day I decided, you know what, I'm done pretending to be straight. We're going to end this marriage. I'm going to move out.
Yeah.
And it was this very Saturnian experience. It was not an easy thing to do, but it was also so key to me figuring out who I was that, you know, I looked at that and it kind of stunned me. And that's not the only indication by any means. There were a ton of things in that particular year in terms of the direction and in terms of the solar return that are right in my face with the sidereal zodiac, but I don't see them in the tropical zodiac. It's not there, other than it being a 12th house perfection year for me. Which, okay, yeah. But,
okay, sure.
Yeah, but it's there.
It's interesting how you know, because I know a lot of things for me have just come out of just where can I hear it? Where can I see it? And that's it. And that's like, that makes I think that makes so much space in astrology, because it's really about just what language can you interpret right now? Like, what can you hear? There's plenty of space for everybody. You know?
Yeah. There is. And the thing that I've primarily begun using the sidereal zodiac in my client work, which is a big change that I didn't think I was going to bring into my practice. So at this point, but my brain works better. I don't know how otherwise to describe that. My brain works better using that lens. I'm also a student of Jyotisha, so that saves me a little bit of translation work. But the other thing too, that does not invalidate in any way my experience with the tropical zodiac. And I think what we actually have are two different lenses on the same reality. Whereas the tropical zodiac is a lens that is defined by the sun and therefore has, I think, a lot more personality to it. I think it has a lot more to do with our internal psychology and our internal experiences and our interpretation of those experiences. Because what does the sun represent? It represents perception itself. It represents raw perception. The sidereal zodiac puts the sun in context.
Sure.
So I think that there's a way that we can think with that philosophically, where it's like working in that lens kind of puts things into a more communal lens. And I want to say, I just want to use this moment to note that I am a newcomer to sidereal astrology, and there are lots of names in there, but I think one of the most prominent names in the last few years is Dana Lynn Knuckles, who's been doing a ton of work just building a sidereal practice and a sidereal methodology from the ground up. She's a really cool person, and I am grateful to know her. And she's doing really cool stuff with this approach too. And I think everyone would do well to learn from her and to listen to what she has to say. But the other thing too is Martin Ganson uses the sidereal zodiac in all of his books too, and he uses it to illustrate the techniques. So that was what made me decide, okay, I'm going to start experimenting with it. And I just kept, this is working a little too well to ignore. So yeah, that's how I ended up there.
And we had, it was about a month ago or so, we also had Athen Chimenti here, and he is a sidereal practitioner. And so we got to start to kind of see through that lens as well, the way that he uses and has completely built his practice too. And just absolutely fascinating, absolutely fascinating.
Yeah. It's fantastic. And my hope is that, we can kind of move away from the factionism of our particular techniques and just use the techniques we love because we love them, and not need to put down other folks based on the techniques that they use. Because as long as we're all going outside and looking at the same sky, we're all going to have a different way of engaging with it. And I think there's a real beauty to the diversity of voices that are contributing to the ecosystem, if you will, of astrological reasoning. And I think that's one of the most beautiful things about this particular historical moment and the development of our tradition, is that we have so many people who are not only plugging into the tradition, but are also exploring and saying, oh, well, what about this? What about this? What about this thing that was revealed to me in a dream? What about this thing that I've experimented with and I've found really good results for? That spirit of exploration and that spirit of openness is something that's so critical if we're going to be folks who are engaging with something as big as the entire sky.
The infinite.
Right.
Yeah. So we've got like one question for you before we wrap here. And I think this is actually a really good question. But people are asking, why do you use the software that you use?
So I use Delphic Oracle because it's easy to use. It's easy to use, particularly for the techniques that I have really refined my practice down into. I do use Solar Fire for horary work just because Delphic Oracle doesn't have a good horary module. But so if you were to see me for a natal consultation, this is what I'm looking at. It's just directions, it's your solar return, it's your nativity. That's all I need. I do have another browser window open with a sidereal ephemeris, but beyond that, I still do most of my prep notes by hand. I don't like a lot of bells and whistles in my, again, Saturn rule descendant. I don't feel the need for a lot of, extra stuff because I don't know.
It can be a lot. I mean, really, if you're taking apart a chart, and this is where I see a lot of the students that I work with, especially one-on-one, the chart gives you too much to talk about. So it's like finding that what you can hear that clearly leaves your client with that heightened sense of consciousness, I think. If I can get that through all the teeth, then that's kind of the goal and the idea, I think, because it will give you too much.
And so then the question is, what do we focus on in the consultation? And a lot of times, folks will say, I want to know about money or relationship or career, or sometimes people come in and they don't know what needs to emerge. And so the conversation, you start in, okay, your ascendant is in Pisces, let's talk about Jupiter. And then that can spark whatever needs to be sparked. And I have a practice of before every consultation, taking about 5 minutes or so and coming into a meditative state and asking my ancestors and asking my the God forms that I'm connected with, Jesus and Mary and Krishna and a couple of other folks, you know, help me to see what needs to be seen, help me to hear what needs to be heard from my client, and help me to say what needs to be said in this moment so that I and my client both emerge from this interaction with our hearts broadened and our perspective broadened. And I go into each consultation, you know, I still like, even I've been seeing clients professionally for about 3 years now. You know, it was full time for most of last year too. And every time before I go into a consultation, I'm still a little nervous because I don't know what's going to come up, or I don't know if they're going to ask about something that I have no way of approaching with my technique, or if they're going to be coming from some other kind of cosmology or worldview that I don't know how to speak to or to interact with. But I feel like so much of our work is not only listening to what the chart is saying, but also listening to the person in front, listening to the person right in front of us. You know, what are they bringing to the reading as well? I think that's so important.
Yeah, there is just universal magic, I think, that comes together when we come together. It's always interesting to be willing enough to be moved out of the way, but be the facilitator. But you know, it's like this whole I just think you've laid it out beautifully. It's just such a beautiful interaction when we come together, and it's special time. It's special time. No matter what we're talking about, it's special time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for coming to lay this out for us, and thank you for the chart example, because we were getting there. We were like, okay, we got to see a chart.
Yeah, I apologize that I felt like that kind of presentation was a little bit scattered, but there again, there are so many different things to hold in mind when you're addressing this. But I have a workshop that I did on primary directions a few months ago. I'll probably be re-presenting it at some point, and it'll be on my website if folks want to connect with that. Also, I'm giving a talk on primary directions at NORWAC this coming spring. So if there is nothing else that hour that seems interest to you, come learn about primary directions, and I will start from the ground up.
Yay.
A plus B equals C. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you did a beautiful job, and we're just really grateful to have had you, and getting thank yous from the chat as well. So I'm grateful.
Thanks, I really appreciate that.
To have had you, and we'll be NORWAC buddies this year. So we
can
elbow to our respective topics. So that's beautiful. So tell us your website really quick, even though I'm going to put it below the video. Just where can we find you?
My website is soulfriendastrology.com. If you go there, you'll find information about booking and all of that. My blog is also there. I need to get some more content on there, so I've kind of dialed back how much I'm doing on social media right now to focus on content creation and planning for big projects in the future. But if you're on Twitter, you can connect with me there at Ryan CRADDOCK. CARADOG is how it's spelled on there. I'm on Facebook, Nathaniel Craddock, just look me up. But I'm trying to limit my social media interaction because it was doing some challenging stuff with my brain and my neurology. So, but you can find me there. You can send me an email. I love to chat with you. I love to do directions on your chart.
Right, come on over, everybody. Get your directions done. Hot off the grill. Yeah, it'll be good. Well, I'll make sure that all of your contacts are below the video so people can find you, and I'm sure that they will, which is always a really neat experience to hear somebody talk and then go interact with them personally. So thank you again so much for coming over.
Yeah, thanks again for having me. And one more thing I want to plug before we wrap up our time. You, of course, were on Achuta Bhavadasa's fall speaker series, I believe. And I'll be doing a presentation next weekend, the 16th, entitled The Christ-Addled Cosmos, Christianity and Astrology. So I'm going to be attempting to integrate Christianity and astrology together in that talk. So that'll be fun.
You're doing it on someone in the chat. It's their birthday, and they are attending that chat on your birthday.
Great.
They said that they were pumped about that. So I look forward to seeing it. And you and I rapped about that just a little bit before. So I'm really, really interested to see how you bring it together. It'll be beautiful.
Yeah, I'm excited about it. Nervous about it, but I am excited about it. It's a big task.
Good, good.
So we'll see how it turns out. But again, thank you so much for having me on, and thank you to all of you who are joining in the chat. Look forward to meeting as many of you as I can.
Yeah, beautiful. All right, you guys, thank you so much. Hopefully we gave you something in this last hour and some change that was worth the time you took to show up. And we look forward to eating and greeting one more time this week. We'll actually be back on Friday with Deborah Silverman, and we're going to talk about elements. It's all elemental, so we'll be back in the saddle just in a couple days. All right, you guys, like this video, comment, share about it.